Good evening, everyone. There's a quiet truth many men carry but rarely speak about. It's the truth that grows slowly in the gap between relationships, in the months, the years, the seasons of being alone. And while the world often tells men to move on, man up, or stay strong, the real story is far deeper, far more human, and far more courageous. Because the longer a man has been without a relationship, the more he discovers about the parts of himself he never had time to face. Solitude becomes a mirror, sometimes comforting, sometimes unforgiving, but always honest. And in that honesty, a man begins to understand what connection truly requires. There is a kind of learning that only solitude can give, a lesson that doesn't arrive with fireworks, but with a quiet ache. When a man spends a long time without a relationship, he begins to understand that emptiness is not a punishment, it's a teacher, and it teaches in whispers. At first, silence feels heavy. The empty spaces in his home, the lack of someone checking in, the quiet nights, they all become mirrors reflecting back the parts of him he used to avoid, the unresolved hurts, the insecurities. The habits he thought were harmless, the emotions he learned to bury because the world told him that men should stay strong, stay unbothered, stay silent. But solitude doesn't let him hide. Over time, he starts noticing things he never paid attention to before. The way he distracts himself from discomfort, the way he avoids vulnerability, the way he rushes or shuts down when things feel too real. He begins to see the difference between loneliness and being unfulfilled, between craving companionship and craving emotional safety. And slowly, that emptiness becomes clarity. He learns that he doesn't just want someone beside him. He wants someone who can meet him in truth. He doesn't want noise. He wants connection. He doesn't want validation. He wants understanding. He doesn't want temporary warmth. He wants a place where his heart can rest without pretending. Emptiness teaches him that love isn't about filling a void, it's about building a life that feels whole first. He begins to understand his own emotional patterns, why he pushes people away, why he holds back, why he chooses certain partners and avoids others. He starts asking deeper questions. What part of me is still healing? What part of me is still afraid? What kind of love do I actually need? Not what I was taught to want. And with that awareness, he transforms. Because when a man learns from emptiness, he stops chasing what looks good and starts valuing what feels right. He becomes more intentional, more grounded, more aware of his emotional blind spots. He grows into the kind of man who can offer a love that isn't desperate, controlling, or performative, but steady, sincere, and emotionally present. Emptiness teaches him who he is without anyone else. That is the foundation of who he becomes with someone else. When a man spends a long time without a relationship, he eventually reaches a moment where he can no longer outrun himself. At first, he may convince himself that staying detached is safer. Avoiding vulnerability feels easier, guarding his heart feels responsible, silence feels like protection. But time has a way of exposing truth. Without a relationship to distract him or a partner to blame, a man begins to notice how much emotional avoidance has shaped his life. He starts seeing the subtle ways he shuts down when conversations get deep, how quickly he changes the subject when feelings become uncomfortable, or how he hides behind humor, work, or independence when connection asks him to be real. He realizes that emotional avoidance doesn't just keep others out, it keeps him trapped on the inside. And that's the cost. Avoiding emotions doesn't protect him, it isolates him. It doesn't make him strong, it makes him disconnected. It doesn't make love safer, it makes love impossible. As the months or years pass, he begins to understand that relationships don't fail because of a lack of love. They often fail because of a lack of emotional courage. The courage to say, that hurt me. The courage to admit, I need help. The courage to express, this matters to me. Time alone holds up the truth like a mirror. Every moment he avoided emotional intimacy, he avoided the chance to be truly known. This realization is humbling, but it's also powerful. Because once a man recognizes the cost of emotional avoidance, he begins to transform the way he connects. Not out of fear, but out of responsibility. He learns that vulnerability is not weakness, it's a doorway to closeness, a doorway to honesty, a doorway to relationships that feel alive rather than hollow. He becomes more aware of his emotional reflexes, the urge to pull away, the instinct to stay silent, the habit of pretending everything is fine. And instead of letting those habits run his life, he starts choosing differently. He begins to speak up instead of shutting down. He lets himself feel instead of numbing. He practices staying present instead of disappearing, and slowly he discovers something surprising. Being emotionally open doesn't make him lose control. It allows him to build connection that feels safe, real, and mutual. The longer he has been without a relationship, the more he understands that love requires showing up fully, not halfway, not partially, not behind walls. And he starts preparing himself to be the kind of man who shows up with integrity, clarity, and emotional presence. Because he finally understands this truth: avoiding feelings doesn't prevent pain, it prevents intimacy. There comes a point in a man's journey, especially after a long period without a relationship, where peace stops being a luxury and becomes a necessity. At first, he may not even notice the shift. He just knows he feels lighter when life is calm, clearer when his space is quiet, and stronger when his mind is uncluttered. Then something inside him changes. He stops chasing intensity and starts choosing peace. Alone time teaches him what true peace feels like, not just the absence of noise, but the presence of emotional stability. No raised voices, no silent treatment, no emotional games, no walking on eggshells, no unpredictable storms, just steady energy, predictable rhythms. A calm nervous system. After experiencing that stillness, chaos loses its charm. The thrill of drama no longer feels exciting. It feels exhausting. The attraction to emotionally unavailable people fades. The urge to prove himself or win someone over disappears. He begins to protect his inner world with a seriousness he never had before, because he finally understands how much peace costs and how much chaos takes. Long periods of singleness shape a man's priorities. He starts recognizing red flags he used to ignore. He becomes more selective about who he lets into his life. He pays attention to how someone talks, how they argue, how they treat people, how they handle stress. What once seemed normal now feels unacceptable. He no longer romanticizes inconsistency. He no longer tolerates emotional volatility. He no longer entertains people who drain him. Peace teaches him that love should not feel like a battlefield. It should not require him to sacrifice his mental health, suppress his truth, or shrink his needs to keep someone happy. So he chooses differently. He learns to listen to his intuition, that quiet voice that says, "This doesn't feel right." He honors it. He doesn't force connections or try to fix people who don't want to change. He stops giving second chances to the same behavior. He stops mistaking attachment for love. He becomes a man who values emotional maturity over superficial attraction, steadiness over excitement, kindness over intensity, and communication over chaos. And here's the beautiful part: when a man truly values peace, the quality of his relationships transforms. He seeks partners who speak with clarity, not confusion. He connects with people who respect boundaries, not break them. He chooses someone whose presence adds to his life instead of disrupting it. This doesn't make him cold or detached. It makes him wise, because the longer he has been alone, the more he understands that peace is not negotiable. The right relationship will never require him to sacrifice it. There is a turning point in a man's life, a moment when he finally understands that being alone and being lonely are not the same thing. It's a realization that usually comes after months or years without a relationship. At first, solitude feels like something he must endure. But then, slowly, it becomes a space he grows into. And in that space, he learns one of the most powerful truths of his life. Emotional independence isn't about being alone, it's about being whole. When a man spends a long time without a partner, he stops outsourcing his emotional world. He no longer looks for someone else to make him feel valuable, wanted, seen, or significant. He learns to validate himself not through someone's affection, attention, or approval, but through the stability he builds internally. He begins to understand that a relationship should complement his life, not complete it. During this time, he builds routines that nourish him, healthier habits, deeper friendships, a stronger sense of purpose. He invests in his passions instead of abandoning them for someone else's expectations. He becomes grounded in who he is instead of molding himself into who someone wants him to be. This independence changes everything, because when a man is emotionally dependent, love becomes a lifeline. But when he becomes emotionally independent, love becomes a choice. He stops chasing people who offer temporary comfort. He stops clinging to relationships out of fear of loneliness. He stops lowering his standards to avoid being alone. Instead, he becomes a man who can stand on his own 2 feet, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, not hardened, but solid, not detached, but self-aware, not unreachable, but stable. He learns to regulate his own emotions, calming himself instead of expecting a partner to soothe him, expressing his needs instead of waiting to explode, communicating with clarity instead of acting out in confusion. Emotional independence teaches him that he is responsible for his own healing, that no one else can rescue him from his past, that no partner, no matter how loving, can fix wounds he refuses to face. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all, a relationship built on dependence will crumble, but a relationship built on 2 independently whole people will thrive. So when he eventually returns to love, whenever that day comes, he shows up differently. He doesn't seek to be saved or completed. He comes ready to share, not to take, to give, not to rely, to connect, not to escape. Because emotional independence has taught him this, he is enough on his own. And from that strength, he can finally love without fear. Time alone has a way of teaching a man what commitment actually means, not the surface level version he learned in his early years, but the real, grown, steady kind of commitment that requires maturity and intention. When a man has been without a relationship for a long time, he naturally becomes more thoughtful about who he lets into his life. He's no longer interested in temporary flings, superficial connections, or relationships built on convenience. He becomes aware that commitment is not just a promise, it's a responsibility to show up with consistency, honesty, and effort. He realizes that commitment is not something you say, it's something you practice. He begins to understand that choosing someone means choosing their world, their emotions, their triggers, their hopes, their fears, their growth. It means being emotionally available, being patient when things get difficult, and being mindful with words and actions. He understands that real commitment isn't about possession, it's about partnership. And because he has spent time alone, he no longer romanticizes the idea of rushing into something just to keep from being lonely. He knows loneliness passes, but mismatched relationships leave scars. So he moves with intention, not desperation. That intention changes the way he chooses love. He doesn't play games. He doesn't pretend to feel what he doesn't. He doesn't make promises his actions can't sustain. He doesn't offer half attention or half effort. He doesn't say yes when his heart says no. Instead, he prioritizes relationships that are built on mutual respect, emotional availability, and shared values. He pays attention to how someone communicates, how they handle conflict, how they treat themselves, how they show care. He observes the small things, not to judge, but to understand. Because the longer he's been on his own, the more he realizes that commitment requires depth, not drama, honesty, not perfection, consistency, not intensity. He learns that choosing one person is not about limiting his life, it's about investing in a connection that enriches it. And he wants to offer the best version of himself, not a rushed or wounded version. Time alone teaches him that commitment is not about avoiding loneliness, it's about building stability, emotional, mental, spiritual, so he can love from a place of abundance rather than neediness. And when he finally commits, he does it wholeheartedly. Not because he needs someone, but because he is finally ready to meet someone as a partner, not a shelter. That is the gift of time. It makes a man patient, intentional, and deeply aware of the weight and beauty of saying, I'm here for real. There is a quiet wisdom that grows in a man who has lived a long stretch of life without romantic love. At first, he might think time is slipping away or that he's falling behind some invisible timeline society handed him. But eventually, something shifts. He stops seeing his singleness as a delay and starts seeing it as preparation. Because the longer he has been alone, the more he understands what a truly aligned connection feels like. He learns that the right relationship is not built on desperation. It's built on compatibility, shared values, emotional safety, and effort. And when a man has been single for a long time, he develops a sharpened intuition. He can tell the difference between chemistry and connection, between temporary excitement and long-term alignment. He has waited long enough to know what is not worth settling for. He no longer falls for potential. He pays attention to patterns. He no longer gets distracted by charm. He values character. He no longer invests in inconsistency. He seeks stability. And most importantly, he no longer believes love is something to rush. He sees it as something to honor, something to enter with clarity, not confusion. Time alone teaches him that there is a difference between wanting a relationship and being ready for one. And the longer he waits, the more he realizes that the right person will not require him to shrink, to chase, to prove, or to compromise his peace. He becomes selective, not because he is picky, but because he is self-aware. He understands that a rushed connection can steal years, while a patient choice can build decades. So he becomes willing to wait for the person who matches his effort, respects his boundaries, understands his silences, and speaks with honesty. Waiting transforms him. He stops asking, when will it happen for me? And starts asking, who do I want to become before it does? This shift is powerful. It turns longing into wisdom. It turns patience into strength. It turns hope into something grounded, not fragile. By the time he chooses love again, if he does, he is choosing from a place of fullness, not emptiness. He is choosing because the connection feels right, not because he fears being alone. He is choosing because he sees a future, not because he needs a distraction. And that is why waiting is not wasted time. It shapes him into a man who can recognize real love when it finally arrives, not the loud kind, not the dramatic kind, but the steady, mature, reciprocal kind that grows with truth, effort, and emotional responsibility. The right connection is worth waiting for because it meets him at the level he has grown into. When a man goes long stretches without a relationship, something powerful happens. He becomes far more aware of what his heart can handle and what it can't. Time alone teaches him the value of boundaries, not as walls to keep love out, but as safeguards to keep emotional chaos, manipulation, and disrespect from getting in. He begins to understand that his peace is not something he can negotiate. It's something he must defend. In the past, he may have let too much slide, things he tolerated to avoid conflict, behaviors he accepted to avoid loneliness, red flags he excused because he didn't want to start over. But with time and distance, he learns to see those moments for what they really were, signs that he didn't yet know how to prioritize his emotional well-being. Solitude changes that. When a man spends time on his own, especially after heartbreak or disappointment, he becomes more careful about who he gives access to. He becomes more intentional with his yes, more confident with his no, and more protective of the emotional energy he brings into any connection. And he realizes something else Boundaries are not about controlling others, they're about honoring himself. He learns to identify what drains him, what triggers him, what destabilizes him. He learns how to separate his responsibility from someone else's. He stops taking on emotional weight that does not belong to him. He grows more comfortable expressing what he needs, what he expects, and what he cannot tolerate. This doesn't make him rigid or cold. It makes him healthy, because the longer he has been alone, the more he sees that relationships built without boundaries become prisons. Relationships built with boundaries become partnerships. He becomes clearer about the kind of woman he can grow with, someone who communicates openly, respects emotional lines, and understands that boundaries are not threats, they are acts of love. He desires a connection where both people protect the relationship, not just their own interests. As his standards rise, his patience rises with them. He stops rushing into situations just because someone shows interest. He stops ignoring behavior that feels off. He stops bargaining with his worth. Instead, he chooses slowly. He listens to his intuition. He pays attention to actions, consistency, and character. He gives his heart only where it feels genuinely safe. This transformation is profound because once a man understands the power of healthy boundaries, he refuses to go back to diluted versions of love. He knows that the right person will not fear his standards, they will match them. They will not test his boundaries, they will honor them. They will not drain him, they will grow with him. The longer he has been alone, the more he learns this truth. Love is not just about finding someone, it's about protecting the version of himself that he has worked so hard to rebuild. When a man spends a long time on his own, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. He starts to build a relationship with himself, not the surface level version of self-care, the real kind. The kind that requires honesty, courage, and a willingness to face the parts of himself he once avoided. At first, the quiet feels uncomfortable. He might fill it with work, distractions, or routines just to avoid feeling alone. But eventually, the quiet becomes familiar. Then it becomes meaningful. And